In the mid-20th century, nymphomania was a catch-all psychiatric diagnosis, heavily weaponized against women who exhibited sexual desires that society deemed excessive, often just women who enjoyed sex as much as men did. If you love uncovering the hidden, salacious histories of classic cinema, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. But be warned, what you're about to hear will forever change how you look at your favorite classic movie stars. 1. Clara Bow. We have to start with the original It Girl. Clara Bow was the defining flapper of the 1920s, a fiery, magnetic star whose raw sexuality leaped off the silent screen. But off-screen, Bow's libido was legendary. Having survived a deeply traumatic childhood marked by severe physical and sexual abuse, Bow used sex as a coping mechanism, seeking validation and affection in the arms of countless men. Her studio, Paramount, constantly had to pay off fixers to keep her name out of the tabloids. She was rumored to have slept with half the men in Hollywood, including Gary Cooper, Bela Lugosi, and director Victor Fleming. The most enduring and heavily debated rumor was that she regularly hosted the entire USC football team at her home for wild, orgiastic parties. While the football team story has been exaggerated by history, biographers agree that Bow's sexual appetite was insatiable, compulsive, and ultimately destructive, contributing to her nervous breakdown and retirement at age 28. 2. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was a theatrical dynamo and a screen actress whose off-screen life was arguably more dramatic than any script. Bankhead was unapologetically hedonistic and famously bisexual, boasting that she had tried everything in the realm of sexual pleasure. When asked if she was a lesbian, she famously quipped, "I'm not bisexual, I'm trisexual. I'll try anything once." Bankhead's sexual conquests were staggering, spanning actors, actresses, royalty, and politicians. She reportedly had affairs with Greta Garbo, Hattie McDaniel, Billie Holiday, and Yul Brynner, among hundreds of others. Bankhead referred to her rampant sexual appetite as her consuming fire, using it to ward off the crippling loneliness and boredom that plagued her between stage and film roles. She made no secret of her exploits, shocking even the most bohemian circles of Hollywood and New York with her graphic descriptions of her nightly activities. 3. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton's tragic life, which we touched upon in our previous video, was fueled by an overpowering, compulsive sexual addiction. The stunning blonde actress, who starred alongside Gregory Peck and James Cagney, seemed determined to self-destruct through her voracious appetite for men. Payton didn't just enjoy sex. She used it as a weapon, a currency, and a drug. She famously engaged in a violent love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal, a scandal that obliterated her career. Her memoir, I Am Not Ashamed, reads like a confession of nymphomania, detailing her relentless pursuit of sexual gratification with mobsters, drifters, and strangers. Even as her career collapsed and she descended into poverty and prostitution, she continued to seek out random sexual encounters in seedy motels and back alleys. Payton's hypersexuality was a tragic compulsion that she was entirely unable to control, ultimately leading to her early death. 4. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the ultimate movie star, a woman who meticulously controlled her image. But behind closed doors, Crawford was renowned for her staggering sexual stamina. Biographers and co-stars alike have described Crawford as having an almost pathological need for sexual conquest. She viewed sex as both a physical release and a power play. She famously had affairs with Clark Gable, which spanned decades, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and even female stars like Marilyn Monroe and Bette Davis, a rumor that adds an incredibly spicy layer to their legendary feud. Crawford's housekeeper, and later biographers, detailed her Sabbath routines, claiming she would spend entire weekends in bed with co-stars, rarely leaving the bedroom. She reportedly had a customized headboard designed for specific, athletic purposes. Crawford's libido was so legendary that it was an open secret on the MGM lot. If she wanted you, resistance was futile. 5. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was a North Carolina farm girl who became the most intoxicatingly beautiful woman in Hollywood, and she knew exactly the effect she had on men. Gardner possessed an earthy, unapologetic sexuality that she refused to hide. She famously married Mickey Rooney when she was just 19, later claiming that the marriage fell apart because Rooney's sexual appetite was pathetic compared to her own. She had passionate, volatile affairs with Howard Hughes, Robert Mitchum, and George C. Scott. But it was her marriage to Frank Sinatra that showcased her insatiable nature. Friends of the couple reported that Gardner's physical demands were so intense that they frequently left Sinatra exhausted. Gardner viewed sex as a joyous, natural act, once famously stating, "I can't imagine anything more pointless than going to bed with a man and not having an orgasm." Her appetite was legendary, and she practically left a trail of exhausted leading men in her wake. 6. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was the ultimate gender-bending siren of the silver screen. While she was married to Rudolf Sieber for decades, the marriage was purely a facade of convenience. Dietrich's sexual appetite was omnivorous and relentless. Dietrich was a key member of Hollywood's Sewing Circle, a secret society of bisexual and lesbian actresses who threw wild, masked orgies at private estates. Dietrich's roster of lovers is practically a who's who of the 20th century. Eric Maria Remarque, John Gilbert, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Edith Piaf, and a rumored affair with John F. Kennedy. But her most famous conquest was the equally voracious Tallulah Bankhead, with whom she engaged in a fiercely competitive, hypersexual relationship. Dietrich used sex to gather secrets, wield power, and satisfy a physical urge that lasted well into her 70s, when she was still reportedly taking young lovers in her Paris apartment. 7. Mae West. Mae West didn't just have an insatiable appetite, she built an entire empire out of it. Starting in the 1910s, West wrote and starred in plays like Sex and The Drag, which were so scandalous they landed her in jail on obscenity charges. When she conquered Hollywood in the 1930s, she was pushing 40, but surrounded herself with a harem of incredibly muscular, young, often non-speaking actors. West was notorious for holding auditions at her apartment that lasted well into the night. Her most famous paramour was the muscle man Reg Roman, but there were dozens of others. West viewed men as playthings, pure and simple. Her biographers noted that her sexual drive was compulsive, and she required constant physical attention, often keeping multiple young men on retainer to fulfill her needs. She practically invented the cougar archetype, living by her famous motto, "Too much of a good thing can be wonderful." 8. Lupe Velez. Known as the Mexican Spitfire, Lupe Velez was a highly volatile, intensely passionate star of 1930s cinema. Velez had a sexual appetite that was as explosive as her famous temper. She was involved in a famously tempestuous relationship with Gary Cooper, whom she allegedly physically assaulted with a knife during fits of jealous rage. Friends of Velez claim she was a textbook nymphomaniac, completely unable to satisfy her physical urges. She was notorious for her appetite, frequently pulling men, famous or otherwise, out of crowds at parties and dragging them into closets or bedrooms. Her second husband, Olympic swimmer Johnny Weissmuller, reportedly found her sexual demands and violent mood swings utterly exhausting. Velez's hypersexuality was deeply intertwined with her emotional instability, creating a chaotic life that culminated in her tragic suicide in 1944. 9. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was discovered at a drugstore counter and quickly dubbed the Sweater Girl. But beneath her glamorous platinum blonde exterior was a woman with a ferocious appetite for men. Turner was married 8 times to 7 different men, but marriage was barely a speed bump for her libido. She famously carried on affairs while her husbands were away, and sometimes while they were in the next room. She had highly publicized romances with Tyrone Power, Frank Sinatra, and a notoriously sadomasochistic relationship with the gangster Johnny Stompanato, who would eventually be stabbed to death by Turner's teenage daughter. Turner admitted in her later years that she was addicted to the thrill of a new romance and the physical act of love. She simply could not be alone, and she required constant physical validation from a rotating cast of handsome, dangerous men. 10. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell, projected a sexuality so intense on screen that it practically melted the celluloid. Off-screen, Harlow was known to be remarkably free-spirited and uninhibited for her time. Studio executives at MGM were constantly frustrated by her refusal to conform to moral clauses. While Harlow was deeply devoted to her second husband, Paul Byrne, before his mysterious suicide, she also had an intense appetite for pleasure. She was famous on the MGM lot for her wild, clothing-optional pool parties at her home. Co-stars like Clark Gable and William Powell were among her many lovers. Harlow viewed sex as a natural, joyful part of life, completely at odds with the repressed morality of the 1930s. While the term nymphomaniac wasn't publicly applied to her, her behind-closed-doors behavior was considered wildly promiscuous by Golden Age standards. 11. Gloria Graham. Gloria Graham was the queen of the film noir Bad Girl. With her pouty lips and twitchy, electric energy, she exuded raw, unfiltered sexuality. Behind the scenes, Graham's sexual proclivities were considered extreme even by Hollywood standards. She was heavily rumored to be a nymphomaniac, with biographers detailing her constant need for sexual gratification, often with little regard for social boundaries. This compulsive behavior culminated in one of Hollywood's greatest scandals. She left her husband, director Nicholas Ray, after catching him in bed with her 13-year-old son from a previous marriage. Rather than seeking help, Graham later married her own stepson, Anthony Ray, when he was in his early 20s. This deeply disturbing relationship destroyed her career, but it was indicative of a woman whose sexual compulsions entirely overrode her moral and social judgment. 12. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was marketed as the working man's Marilyn Monroe, a buxom, exaggerated sex symbol who used her body as a relentless publicity tool. But Mansfield didn't just play a nympho for the cameras, she lived it. Famous for her wardrobe malfunctions decades before the term existed, Mansfield used sex to shock the public. Behind the scenes, her appetite was legendary. She was a high priestess in the Church of Satan, befriending Anton LaVey, who praised her unapologetic hedonism. Mansfield's third husband, Matt Cimber, directed her in a notoriously terrible film called Single Room Furnished, in which she played a desperate, sex-obsessed woman, essentially playing herself. Her endless string of affairs, wild parties, and exhibitionist tendencies were a manifestation of a deep-seated need for attention and physical validation that she could never truly satisfy. 13. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr shocked the world in the 1933 Czech film Ecstasy, which featured the first simulated orgasm in cinematic history. That scene set the tone for her entire life. Lamarr was fiercely intelligent. She invented the technology that would later become Wi-Fi, but she was also possessed of a deeply compulsive sexual appetite. Her 6 marriages were all intense and physically driven, but they couldn't contain her. She famously had an affair with John F. Kennedy and was notorious for picking up handsome young men at Hollywood parties, often disappearing with them for hours. Lamarr's autobiography detailed her obsession with her own physical pleasure, once claiming that her sexual appetites were so strong that they frequently interfered with her ability to memorize her lines. For Lamarr, sex was an addiction that she alternately celebrated and feared. 14. Jascha Gabor. Jascha Gabor treated romance and sex as a full-time, highly lucrative profession. The Hungarian-born actress was married 9 times, famously quipping, "I am a marvelous housekeeper. Every time I leave a man, I keep his house." But Gabor wasn't just a gold digger. She had a genuine, insatiable physical appetite for men. She viewed the male body as an art form to be collected and enjoyed. Gabor had countless affairs, including a heavily rumored liaison with her stepson, Conrad Hilton Jr., and an affair with Richard Burton. Gabor was completely unrepentant about her hypersexuality, seeing it as a European privilege that American prudes simply didn't understand. She required constant adoration and physical intimacy, and she famously continued to take young lovers well into her 70s and 80s. 15. Marilyn Monroe. We close with the most famous woman of the 20th century. Marilyn Monroe's relationship with sex was deeply complex, intertwined with severe childhood trauma and a desperate need to be loved. But by the mid-1950s, Monroe's behavior had escalated to a level that her psychiatrists and biographers later classified as hypersexuality or nymphomania. She used sex as a currency to advance her early career, but it quickly became a compulsion. Monroe was notorious on sets for disappearing into her dressing room with electricians, grips, and assistants. Her marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller couldn't contain her appetites, and she had intense, often overlapping affairs with both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, as well as co-stars like Yves Montand and Clark Gable. Her final psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, documented her compulsive need to seduce men, almost any man, as a tragic, uncontrollable reflex. For Marilyn, sex was simultaneously a source of power and a profound, destructive curse. The term nymphomania is no longer recognized by modern psychology, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of hypersexuality, trauma, and female sexual liberation. But in old Hollywood, these women were navigating a treacherous landscape. They were expected to be sex symbols for the masses, but punished if they actually enjoyed sex in their private lives. Their compulsions, whether born of trauma, rebellion, or simply an unchecked human drive,